My talk today is called Sculpture and the Haptic Imagination, and it's a title that probably needs some explanation. So the source of the term haptic, as I shall use it here, is not the writings of Alois Riegel, with which many of you will be familiar, but rather recent scientific and philosophical studies in which the term is used to characterize the active deployment of our sense of touch. So the core distinction here is between normal touch experiences, understood as a primarily passive response to external stimuli, and haptic perception, understood as dynamic and exploratory, an engagement with the external environment. So Matthew Fulkerson offers a clear summary of the distinction. He says, tactile experiences are mostly passive and tend to be directed at the subject's body, whereas haptic perceptions are typically active, controlled, and almost always object-directed in their character. So if I register a sensation of heat or pressure upon my skin, that's a typical touch experience. But if I use my sense of touch to find out something about the world by reaching out and squeezing an object, flexing it to test its pliability, or running my fingers over its surface to discover its texture, then I'm engaging in haptic perception. So the former is primarily passive. It's something that happens to us or that we undergo. And the latter is active, intentional, and purposive. It's a way of gathering information about the world. Now, for my talk today, the key point on which I wish to focus is the recognition that haptic perception typically has an extended temporal character. So here's Fulkerson again. He says, typical haptic experiences seem essentially to unfold over time, requiring us to connect different moments together in the formation of complex tactile representations. So one way of thinking about this is to think of haptic perception as touch in motion. We actively use our sense of touch to explore the world and to learn about it. Now let me give you one more quotation, this time from the philosopher Alvin Noé, in his much discussed book, Action in Perception. So perception is not something that happens to us or in us. It is something we do. Think of a blind person tap-tapping his or her way around a cluttered space, perceiving that space by touch, not all at once, but through time by skillful probing and movement. This is, or at least ought to be, our paradigm of what perceiving is. The world makes itself available to the perceiver through physical movement and interaction. So Noé contends that when thinking about vision, normally, we tend to make vision, not touch, our paradigm. And we tend to think of vision on a kind of photographic model. You open your eyes and you are given all at once a sharply focused impression of the present world in all its detail. And what Noé is trying to do is say, well, look, let's get rid of that image. And by taking haptic perception rather than vision as the paradigm, he wants us to free us of this misconception. He contends that all perception is inactive. It's something that we do, not something that simply happens to us. And it's inherently temporal. It takes place over time. So this recognition that haptic perception is temporally extended links closely to my own attempts, I've been doing over several years now, to understand the dynamic and exploratory character of our imaginative engagement with works of art. And I'm only now beginning to consider how haptic perception can be incorporated into this account. But I think the connections lie ready to hand, and to my mind at least, they look highly promising. So my thoughts on this subject are still at a relatively early stage, and I hope you're going to bear with me. The guiding idea behind this paper is it's possible to further develop and perhaps to further complicate some work I've already done on imaginative engagement by properly acknowledging the role of haptic perception in the apprehension of sculpture and other three-dimensional artworks. Now, it's going to take quite a run-up to get to the questions that interest me, but I hope the wider context is going to prove useful. So I'm going to begin with a brief summary of what I take to be one of the central insights of Lessing's Laocoön, or On the Limits of Poetry and Painting, which was published over 250 years ago in 1766. Now, it might initially seem counterintuitive to start out from the work of an 18th century German art theorist, but I'm strongly committed to the view that it's possible to bring the German aesthetic tradition into dialogue with contemporary concerns, rather than treating it merely as something of historical interest. So one of the reasons for the enduring contemporaneity of Lessing's Laocoön is that he directly addresses the differences between literature and the visual arts, seeking to understand the different ways in which these two art forms engage their audiences. And although his proposals have proved controversial, it's widely agreed that he stakes out the fundamental issues. So Lessing starts out from the observation that whereas literature as a narrative art can represent a continuous sequence of events, static visual arts, such as painting and sculpture, are restricted to the representation of a specific moment in time. I'm hoping this is familiar ground to you. Now, although Lessing employs the distinction between succession and simultaneity as a means of determining the limits of poetry and painting, his contention that actions are the true subjects of poetry, whereas bodies with their visible properties are the true subjects of painting, fails to compel conviction, i.e. it's unpersuasive, not least because it imposes limits that are self-evidently breached in practice. He's quickly forced to concede that the full range of subject matter is in fact available to both forms of art. And in a characteristic reversal, he qualifies his own position by observing that. That's a great quotation. He says, "Bodies do not exist in space, but also in time. They persist in time, and in each moment of their duration, they may assume a different appearance or stand in a different combination. Each of these momentary appearances and combinations is a result of the preceding one, and can be the cause of a subsequent one, which means that it can be, as it were, the center of an action. Consequently, painting too can imitate actions, but only by suggestion, Andeutungsweise, through bodies." So this crucial shift in Lessing's argument allows him to acknowledge the active role of the imagination in the appreciation of works of art. Through the disposition and arrangement of the figures, the artist can prompt the viewer to imagine actions and events that are not directly depicted. And it's as a development of this insight that Lessing arrives at his celebrated conception of the fruitful moment. And again, I'm going to put the passage up in full because it's got the most extended discussion of what Lessing terms the free play, the freie Spiel of the imagination. Again, I think it's a tremendous piece of writing. So, he says, "Since the works of both the painter and the sculptor are created not merely to be given at a glance, but to be contemplated repeatedly and at length, it is evident that the single moment and the point of view from which the whole scene is presented cannot be chosen with too great a regard for its effect. But only that which allows the imagined free play, a freie Spiel, is effective. The more we see, the more we must be able to imagine, and the more we add in our imagination, the more we must think we see. In the full course of an emotion, no point is less suitable for this than its climax. There is nothing beyond this, and to present to the eye what is most extreme is to bind the wings of fancy and constrain it, since it cannot soar above the impression made on our senses." Now, Lessing's account of the free play of the imagination is clearly in tension with his attempt to establish medium-specific restrictions on poetry and painting. For the greater the reach of our imaginative capacities, the less the artist is constrained by the inherent features of her chosen medium. So this argument pulls against the very ambition of the Laocoön itself. And in particular, the claim that painting and sculpture as spatial arts are not equipped to sustain the kind of sequential understanding required for the comprehension of a temporal process is undermined by Lessing's recognition that the viewer can imaginatively reconstruct the preceding and succeeding stages that lead up to and follow from the depicted moment. So having given you this brief summary of Lessing, I now want to focus more closely on the role of the imagination. And in doing so, I'm going to draw on and adapt some ideas put forward by the English philosopher Anthony Saville. In his book Aesthetic Reconstructions, he investigates whether Lessing's proposals might be developed in a more systematic way, supplementing what he terms Lessing's exiguous elucidation of the workings of the imagination with his own threefold analysis of imaginative engagement. And his proposals are of independent interest, and they deserve, I believe, wider recognition. Here I shall focus on his account of projective and ampliative imagining, setting to one side his discussion of exploratory imagining. In all three cases, he seeks to show that the viewer's responses can be prompted or guided by identifiable features of the work, while at the same time going beyond what's directly depicted. And like Lessing, he's exclusively concerned with representational art, restricting his discussion to figurative painting and sculpture. Okay, finally, I'm going to get to some examples. It gets lighter going. Okay. So, to explain what he means by projective imagining, Saville asks us to consider Matthias Grunewald's The Mocking of Christ. The painting shows the seated figure of Christ tormented by jeering soldiers, one of whom has his arm raised to strike a powerful blow. Saville observes that a common experience of the work is for the spectator to project himself into the picture by identifying with the soldier and in imagination completing the blow that we see is about to fall. No matter how disturbing this might be, we are prompted to imagine striking the blow ourselves. Now, it's central to Saville's account that the exercise of the projective imagination is unwilled in the sense that it's directly triggered by the experience of viewing the work, rather than being sought out or discovered. While the viewer retains a degree of freedom insofar as she's invited to imagine the completion of an action that's not itself depicted, the striking of the blow has a natural terminus that guides the direction of our thought. Now, Saville's analysis can be further developed by asking whether the viewer is always led to identify with the soldier rather than the figure of Christ. It can be argued with equal plausibility that the painting prompts us to project ourselves into the position of the person receiving the blow rather than delivering it, and thus to identify empathetically with Christ's sufferings. The significance of this modification can be shown by considering an alternative example. This is Artemisia Gentileschi's painting, Jael and Sisera. The painting presents an episode from the Book of Judges in which the sleeping Canaanite chieftain Sisera is slain by the Hebrew Jael. Here too, it is hard not to imagine the striking of the blow, for the tight focus of the composition is entirely concentrated on this single action. In viewing the painting, we are aware of the energy stored up in Jael's raised arm, and we anticipate the fall of the hammer onto the metal peg that she has placed so carefully at the back of Sisera's head, just behind his right ear. However, Gentileschi offers us no clear guidance as to whether we should identify with the perpetrator or the victim, and the unsettling quality of the painting has much to do with this seemingly deliberate indeterminacy. While it is perhaps more natural to project ourselves into the position of the person carrying out the action, the prone body of Sisera, who is depicted in the tranquility of sleep, also invites us to imaginatively identify with his state of rest. A tension arises between our sense of time stilled by sleep and the imminent violence of the action, whose course we follow through in our imagination. So let's now turn to the ampliative imagination. As the term ampliative suggests, this form of imaginative engagement also reaches beyond what is directly depicted, but it goes much further in extending or adding to what is actually shown. So in exercising the ampliative imagination, the viewer occupies the standpoint from which he actually sees the work, rather than taking up the standpoint of a participant within the depicted scene. And what Saville has in mind here are works of narrative sculpture and painting that invite the viewer to imagine what led up to the moment depicted and what takes place afterwards. In such cases, the viewer is challenged to visualize how a scene that is presented could have come about, and challenged also to think through in sensible detail how it might have developed. So Lessing's choice of the antique sculptural group Laocoön provides a particularly striking example. The sculpture depicts a single moment in the death struggles of Laocoön and his two sons as they are attacked by sea serpents. However, as Lessing himself observes, the viewer is prompted to imagine the larger temporal process of which this forms a part. So while the viewer's responses are guided by what is shown, the contortion of the figures and the entwinement of the serpents around their limbs, there is considerable scope for freedom of thought in the detailed imagining of the preceding and succeeding moments. Here the viewer is required to think through for himself the possible run-up to and follow-through from the depicted scene, drawing on her familiarity with the story of Laocoön and his sons. So while the viewer's responses are guided by what is shown, there is scope for freedom of thought in the detailed imagining of the preceding and succeeding moments. The work prompts us to imagine these things, but it doesn't tell us exactly what to imagine. Now, it's noteworthy that Saville, like Lessing, conceives the selection of the appropriate moment in normative terms. So in Saville's cautious wording, it can be a contributory factor to painterly or sculptural success that the ampliative imagination should be able to exercise itself satisfactorily. So I'm going to come back to this idea because I want to ask whether it might also hold for works of non-representational art. Is there also a normative dimension in our identification of the appropriate moment? So the key issue explored by Saville is an analysis of both projective and ampliative imagining. Is the extent to which the viewer's responses can be said to be guided or directed by the artist. It can plausibly be argued that the imagination is already at work when we apprehend the depicted content of a sculpture or a painting. For the material object present before us, a smooth marble surface or patches of colour on woven canvas, is quite different in appearance to the figure or scene that we see it as representing. However, this process entirely escapes our voluntary control, and it seems more natural to say that we see rather than we imagine the muscular contractions of Laocoön or the raised arm of Jael. And here there seems little doubt that the artist is able to control the viewer's responses, which depend for the most part on involuntary perceptual processes. By contrast, as Saville acknowledges, projective imagining, and to an even greater degree ampliative imagining, involve a kind of freedom or spontaneity, allowing the viewer considerable license in how she responds to the work. So Saville's position depends on showing that what Lessing terms the free play of the imagination should nonetheless not be understood simply as free association or the projection of merely subjective thoughts and emotions onto the work of art, but as a capacity to respond to cues that are provided by the work itself. He draws an informative contrast with an alternative count of imaginative freedom, which takes the work of art as a prompt for what he terms Walter Mitty-ish fantasizing. So Walter Mitty is a character, you may know it, from a story by the American writer James Thurber. There's been a few films made of it, one with Ben Stiller, I think. Anyway, so Mitty has a vivid imagination, and he uses this to escape from his mundane existence through elaborate daydreams in which he features as a hero in various dramatic situations, such as being a fighter pilot or a surgeon who's able to step in at the right moment. So someone who responded to the Laocoön sculptural group in this way might think of herself as a heroic grand captain and imagine leading the assembled tourists in the Vatican to the rescue of the priest and his sons, freeing their arms and legs from the coils of the serpents, and perhaps slaying the terrifying creatures. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this kind of imaginative activity, which provides a potentially rewarding way of passing one's time in the Vatican. But considered as a response to the work, it's exposed to three related objections. Okay, so first, it's all too private, in the sense that our imaginings are allowed to wander as they please, rather than being guided by features of the work. The content of private fantasy is just what we make it, and insofar as it plays freely, it's hardly answerable to the work that sparks it off. Second, such imagining can only be developed as our concentration detaches itself from the work that provokes it. It is then the fantasy that properly engages our attention, and not the work itself. And then finally, since this kind of imagining can go in any direction that the viewer wishes, it's not in any sense controlled by the work of art or the intentions of the artist. And it's not something that speaks of the artwork qua art. The work functions as a kind of prop or stimulus for fantasizing, but not as something that's able to hold our attention in its own right. So Lessing's brief but highly suggestive account of the fruitful moment and the role of the imagination in sustaining the close and sustained attention required by works of art makes it clear, I think, that he succeeds in avoiding these problems. As Saville points out, Lessing is insistent that the free play of imagination has to coexist with, fortify even, i.e. make stronger the attention we fix on the work, and it's thus of a kind that's resistant to the temptation to private fantasy. So Sever concludes that if we're going to acknowledge the difference between these two approaches, we are required to find a different way of taking Lessing's talk of imagination's free play, and one that permits of exercise within the artist's control. That is, in a way that makes it answerable to the work that invites it. Only then will the richness that the imagination brings to its engagement with the artist's representation be genuinely attributable to the work and properly bear upon its critical evaluation. So the central idea here is that if our imaginative responses are to be answerable to the work, rather than becoming detached from it in the manner of private fantasy, we need to be attentive to the way in which the artist has employed the materials at her disposal. And this in turn requires that we acknowledge a distinction between the materials out of which something is made and the use of those materials as a medium over which the artist exercises control. We see the work as guiding our responses rather than simply as providing an opportunity for free association or our merely subjective reveries. Okay, so the turn away from the direct depiction of the human body in much 20th century sculptural practice and the emergence of various forms of non-representational object making might be thought to cast doubt on the continued relevance of Lessing's ideas. And it goes without saying that he was exclusively concerned with figurative painting and sculpture. So the question I now want to address is whether Lessing's theory of the fruitful moment and its elaboration in terms of the exercise of projective and ampliative imagining might also have application to some examples of more recent artistic practice. And more specifically, I want to investigate whether Saville's analysis of our capacity for projective and ampliative imagining is relevant to object-based sculptural practices that eschew or avoid the direct representation of the human body, but that nonetheless elicit a range of responses that are grounded in our bodily awareness of factors such as weight, volume, force, and movement. And here too, or so I shall argue, the viewer is invited to employ her imaginative abilities in a temporally structured way that remains, at least to some extent, within the artist's control. Now, I defend only the weaker claim that the ideas presented here have relevance to at least some works of non-representational sculpture. But if the claim can be substantiated, it would allow me to establish some surprising continuities in the kinds of imaginative response that can be sustained by both representational and abstract works of art. So this is Richard Serra's stacked steel slabs made in the Fontana Steel Yards in 1969. So it was constructed by placing individual slabs of steel, each weighing over 6 tons, one on top of the other. And he stacks the slabs up until the point at which the addition of one further slab would have caused the stack to topple over. So here's the thought. The work represents, or rather instantiates, an arrested moment in a larger temporal process. The viewer is made aware both of the massiveness and weight of the materials and the precariousness of the unstable balance that's been achieved. Now, the stack is secured solely by the weight of the steel. There's no hidden armature or welding. The force of gravity that keeps it in place also threatens to bring it down. And the slabs are held together in a way that invites recognition of their placement against each other and their eventual falling away. Now, we don't see that the slab structure is about to fall, because it's only the idea of adding a further slab to the stack that generates the required instability. And that's something we have to imagine for ourselves. So stacked steel slabs thus calls on our ampliative imagination, insofar as we're asked to think through a temporal process that's not directly represented. And more speculatively, it also engages the projective imagination, insofar as we're invited to register a correspondence between the form of the stack and the upright human body. The viewer's awareness of the downward pull of gravity on her own body and the effort required to sustain an upright posture encourages a projective identification with the held verticality of the sculpture. And the massiveness and weight of the materials is clearly also important here. So this can be seen by looking at another work by Serra. This is 1 ton prop. So as the title indicates, each of the plates of hardened lead weighs 1 ton. The stability of the balance of the plates against each other is secured by their sheer weight. Think how different the effect would be in the case of 4 playing cards. And here too, I think, we have a sense of an arrested moment, of objects being held together in a way that evokes recognition both of their placement in this configuration and their eventual falling or coming apart. Okay, let me give you 2 other examples. The first is an installation view of a work by Bill Bollinger called Cyclone Fence. So the work was created through a simple act of twisting. By laying the fence on the floor, Bollinger emphasizes both its original flatness and the way in which this has been disrupted by the use of a rotational force. So the twisting of the fence generates a tension that is held constantly in place while the sculpture remains on the ground. As with stacked steel slabs, it's possible to see this as an arrested or fruitful moment. The viewer is asked to bring vividly to mind the physical process through which the fence has been twisted and the corresponding action that's required to restore it to its original state. So although static and non-representational, the sculpture has a temporal structure that's indexed in the ascending curve of the fence as it rises up from the floor. An elegantly simple exploration of the same phenomenon is given by Giovanni Anselmo in his Torsione of 1969. So it consists of a 1.5 meter iron bar hung from a wall by a twisted piece of fabric attached to a hook. The work's made by turning the bar round and round to achieve the highest torsion possible and then blocking it against the wall to prevent the return movement. Now, it's almost impossible to view the sculpture without imagining what would happen were the bar to be lifted away from the wall to allow the stored energy to be released. Now, while it's difficult to see how we can occupy a standpoint internal to either of these works, and that's what's required for projective imagining, I think we still need to feel within our own bodies the containment and release of opposing forces. Now, the sculptures I've discussed here are abstract or non-representational in the sense that there's no depicted content. They consist simply in the rearrangement or organization of familiar materials. Nonetheless, or so I've suggested, the viewer is asked to respond to the way in which the artist has deployed the materials by imaginatively reconstructing the processes involved and thinking through the consequences. The works thus have an explicitly temporal dimension, even though there's no clear narrative context, or at least nothing equivalent to the story of Laocoön and his sons or the mocking of Christ. So I now want to consider some examples of non-figurative sculpture whose process of making has got a more extended developmental character, providing something a little bit closer to a story or a narrative, even though it's not directly depicted in the work itself. So this is Gabriel Orozco's Yielding Stone. So Orozco took a lump of plasticine, the same weight as his own body, hammered it into a rough sphere, and then rolled it through the streets, first in Monterrey in his native Mexico in 1992, and then later that same year in New York. So the oily synthetic material picked up and incorporated detritus from the journey, as well as being marked by the impact with other objects. And the sculpture is sometimes exhibited along with photographs such as this that show a particular stage on the journey. Now the viewer is invited to imagine the before and after of the itinerary, the effort that it must have taken to roll 150 pounds of plasticine through the streets, and of course, to make the imaginative connection between the weight of the materials and the artist's own body. The identification of the object as a surrogate for the artist is sustained in part by the malleability of plasticine and its skin-like surface, but also by its evident responsiveness to the environment through which it travels. The form of the object is thus inseparable from the process of its making, as this took place over time. To fully appreciate Yielding Stone, it seems that some awareness of the context of its production is required. It's only by bringing to bear knowledge of how the object was made that we can imaginatively call to mind the journey it underwent before taking up its resting place in the gallery. And this in turn informs our response to the resulting shape of the object and the fragments of matter that remain embedded in its surface. Consider now St. Frigo by the Native American artist Jimmy Durham. The work consists in a dented and damaged refrigerator that's exhibited as a freestanding sculptural object. To make the work, the artist performed a daily routine of throwing stones at the refrigerator for 1 hour each day over a 10-day period. Here too, a considerable amount of energy was expended, albeit in a highly disciplined and ritualistic manner. Now, the title of the work, St. Frigo, with its connotations of martyrdom, establishes a link with iconoclasm and the stoning of persons rather than objects. The resulting sculptural object is powerfully evocative. Once provided with the relevant information about the method of making, we have little difficulty in establishing an imaginative connection between the buckled and pitted surface of the refrigerator and the controlled violence of the action that left it in this ruined state. So I haven't yet said anything directly about the role played by our sense of touch or by haptic perception. But I think it's clear that each of these examples, in different ways, invite powerful tactile and haptic responses. So I began by observing that the distinction between the sense of touch, understood as a passive response to external stimuli, and haptic perception, identified as an active and exploratory engagement with the external environment, provides a valuable starting point for thinking through these issues. The identification of haptic perception as an active process of exploration acknowledges a temporal dimension that is absent, or at least less clearly marked, in the sensation of touch alone, understood simply as the pressure of something against the skin and the corresponding sensation. So exploration through haptic perception can take place in real time, as for example, when we use our hands or some other part of our body to investigate our environment or unfamiliar material. However, it can also take place through imaginative engagement. We imaginatively explore what it would be like to grasp, stroke, twist, lift, squeeze, push, or bend something. Now, it's long been recognized that sculpture is particularly effective at soliciting tactile responses. But it goes without saying that these responses are predominantly imaginative rather than actual. In the vast majority of cases, we do not literally touch the surface of a sculpture, and to do so would often run counter to, or interrupt our tactile imaginings. So it seems plausible to suggest that artworks that invite projective and ampliative responses in the viewer also invite haptic engagement, or what we might venture to term the haptic imagination. And the link here, if there is one, is provided by the overtly temporal character of such imaginings. So it's with reference to the body and to proprioceptive awareness of our own held verticality that we imaginatively engage with the precarious stability of Sarah's stacked steel slabs. To imagine the placement of an additional slab is mentally to explore the effects of weight, gravity, texture, and friction in holding the stack together and the tension between these opposing forces. The force coiled up in Bollinger's cyclone fence is something that we can imagine exerting ourselves through twisting the metal, bringing our hands actively into play. Similarly, Anselmo's torsione invites us to imagine grasping the bar with our hand and using our strength to turn it away from the wall. The connection is even more overt in the case of Orozco's yielding stone, for here the oily and malleable surface of the sculpture serves as a surrogate for the surface of the skin, and there's a direct correlation between the weight of the sculpture and the weight of the artist's own body. We're invited to imagine not only what the sculpture feels like, what it would be like to touch, but also what it would be like to handle, push, and manipulate. And finally, St. Frigo, which also serves as a kind of surrogate for the human body, invites us imaginatively to run our hands over its dented surface, and perhaps even to imagine the action of throwing that led to these pits and scars. In each of these examples, dynamic haptic responses are called into play, either alongside or in conjunction with the workings of the projective and ampliative imagination, taking place over time in an extended temporal sequence. So we can examine these ideas further by considering two works of art that represent limit cases, or what more strongly we might think of as two kinds of failure to engage the projective and ampliative imagination. And also now I want to add the haptic imagination. So the first is Andreas Ślemiński's imprint of a nose cone of a glider. So Ślemiński is known for producing works that require a disproportionate expenditure of time and effort, leaving only a minimal trace in the gallery. So to make this work, a full-sized glider plane with a 40-foot wingspan was brought into the gallery space and then gently rolled against a pink rectangular foam block mounted on the wall, so that the tip of its nose left a small round impression. The glider was then removed and the windows replaced, so that the only thing the visitors to the exhibition could see was the indented piece of foam. Ślemiński's imprint of the nose cone of a glider possesses a mordant humour, and perhaps too a serious intent in drawing attention to the excessive licence that is sometimes granted to contemporary artists. As a work of conceptual art, it is a sophisticated intervention into the gallery system. It can therefore be seen as highly successful in its own terms. However, considered from the standpoint of the viewer's imaginative engagement with the exhibited object, the reduction of such a complex and demanding process of manufacture to two round indentations in the upper half of a rectangular piece of foam effectively blocks the possibility of pursuing a trajectory of thought that is guided by determinate features of the work. In this case, there just doesn't seem to be enough in the resulting object to stimulate the viewer's projective or ampliative imagination. The viewer is asked to imagine something, but she's not given sufficient guidance by the work itself. And the same holds for what I've termed the haptic imagination. For although we can imagine what it might be like to touch this surface and to run our hands over the indentations, this does not connect in an informative or productive way to the construction of the work, or to an overtly temporal structure that's inherent to its appreciation. Although the work still invites tactile responses, our haptic imagination, as a response to the work, is effectively blocked. The second example, which lies at the other extreme, is Cornelia Parker's Cold Dark Matter, an Exploded View, which was first exhibited at the Chisenhall Gallery in East London in 1991 and is now in the collection of Tate Modern. So the work consists of the gathered fragments of a garden shed exploded by the British Army School of Ammunition at the artist's request, together with various other objects ranging from garden tools to children's toys. The surviving pieces are suspended from the ceiling by invisible wires as if captured and held mid-explosion. Arranged in the form of a cube that measures 4 meters square, the fragments are lit by a single light bulb at the centre that throws elongated shadows onto the gallery's walls, floor and ceiling. Now the work has a companion piece, Cold Dark Matter, an Unexploded View, presented at the Chisenhall earlier the same year, when Parker exhibited the shed prior to its destruction. A light illuminates the structure from within, while plastic sheeting over the windows prevents the viewer from seeing inside. Now, although the resulting sculptural object is visually arresting, it's arguable that here too, both the method of making and the form of display impede the free play of the projective and ampliative imagination. The problem in this case is that by providing us with both a before and after view, the responses open to us have been too tightly specified. The moment of the explosion is magnificently dramatized, but our imaginations are held in place by the spectacle of the work's presentation. The force and rapidity of the blast eludes our detailed imaginative comprehension, and we are left with an image of the shed in two different states, each of which is successful in its own terms, but which cannot be connected through a series of intermediate stages, leaving little for the imagination to contribute through its own projective or ampliative activity. The same holds once again for the haptic imagination. The force of the blast cannot be imaginatively apprehended through haptic exploration. The shards of wood and remaining fragments that hang from the ceiling in the resulting installation do perhaps invite us what it might be like to touch or manipulate these objects, but this is disconnected from the event of the explosion itself, and it's hard to see how the temporal structure of such imagining might be guided by features that are internal to the work. So if these two works do indeed represent limit cases, it can plausibly be argued that there is a normative dimension to our imaginative engagement with abstract sculptural objects. Saville's contention that the ampliative imagination should be able to exercise itself satisfactorily can usefully be extended to works of non-figurative sculpture, for there are ways in which the attempt to engage the imagination can break down or fail that are themselves informative. And it's noteworthy that neither of these examples are designed to activate proprioceptive or bodily engaged responses that depend on the viewer sharing the same physical space as the work. So Slominski's imprint of the nose cone of a glider is a shallow relief that's mounted on a facing wall, while Parker's cold dark matter, with its dramatic use of lighting, is designed to be viewed from a distance. As I've been at pains to emphasize, both works are successful in their own terms, but I think they're also useful for helping us to understand the ways in which the artist's use of materials can stimulate or impede our imaginative responses. I don't want to press these distinctions too hard. My suggestion, and here for the moment it's little more than that, is that there is a direct link between projective and ampliative imagining and what I've termed haptic imagination, and that this link is informed by the overtly temporal and dynamic character of these three forms of imaginative engagement. So I want to conclude by considering one final example, Lydia Clark's Stone and Air from 1966, and that forms part of a series of so-called sensory objects. So there are many different iterations of this work, but all involve the same basic materials. A stone is allowed to rest on an inflated plastic bag so that it's fully enveloped. And then if the bag is compressed, this lifts the stone up, allowing it to become visible. I've got a photograph here. That's Lydia Clark herself activating the work. But Stone and Air was presented in such a way that the viewers were allowed to handle the work themselves and to perform this simple but highly controlled action. And it forms one of a series of pieces in which Clark sought to overcome the traditional distance imposed between the viewer and the work. Other examples include the so-called bichos, or critters, with their hinged planes that the viewers can manipulate by hand to create different configurations. The parts are functionally related, and only a limited range of movements are possible. So these works can't be reshaped at will. Nonetheless, the viewers got to actively explore and discover the permissible configurations using their hands as well as their imagination. And the same holds for Stone and Air. The viewer must learn how to compress the bag in such a way that the stone is lifted upwards and released downwards without falling out, exerting the right amount of pressure to control its movements. Now, what distinguishes these works from the other examples I've discussed, of course, is that the viewer is invited actually to touch the sculpture and to manipulate it. But here too, I believe, the haptic imagination is brought into play. In order to move from the traditional standpoint of distance observer to that of active participant, the viewer first has to imaginatively apprehend the ways in which the materials can be manipulated. The handling of the object is a way of testing and exploring our imaginative responses, bringing the two into coordination with one another. Our tactile imaginings are already in play, even when we simply view the object. If this is right, then rather than blocking or undermining our imaginative responses, Lydia Clark's works of this period provides a means of acknowledging the significance of tactile imagining. They help us to recognize that this kind of imaginative engagement is required for a full appreciation of three-dimensional form, even if, in the vast majority of cases, we are unable to confirm our imaginings through active intervention. Clark's sensory objects allow us to work through in real time processes that we have already thought through in imagination. So it might be countered, I think, with some justification that I've discussed a limited subset of artworks that happen to fit my argument. And there's no doubt a moment of truth in this. I fully accept that not all sculptural objects call on the viewer's capacity for projective, ampliative, or haptic imagination, and the position I've presented is correspondingly limited in its application. But I have sought to establish that at least some works of non-representational sculpture possess a more or less explicit temporal dimension, and that when this is the case, the viewer is able to use her imagination to fill out and complete a temporally extended sequence that's not itself directly represented. And this represents, I hope, a valuable extension of Lessing's original insight, and it goes some way to bring his ideas in dialogue with subsequent art practice. Far more needs to be done to show that the haptic imagination has a corresponding role here, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to think about these issues and to think harder about what's actually involved. Great, thanks very much. Thank you.